Okay, so I was gonna make a video about Nintendo's battle to remain relevant in a generational transition they're not taking part in, but PlayStation decided that they wanted to announce something dumb that I'm annoyed about, so for today's video, we're pivoting to the practice of console exclusivity, the nuance that exists in that practice, and obviously how that all relates to Nintendo. Let's talk about it. Platform exclusivity is nothing new, and in many ways was and is the driving force behind the success of gaming platforms. In their most basic form, I personally have no issues with this concept. After all, if you run a business that is capable of funding a platform and the games that play on that platform, you as the game's producer have no real onus to make your creations available on other unowned platforms. This is an oversimplification that I want to expound on as we go throughout the video, but it's important to lay out this concept in its most basic form to understand the way I mostly feel about this issue as it relates to Nintendo, because this is a thing that comes up all the time. I want Mario on PlayStation, I want Metroid on Xbox, you know, you've heard the whole thing. In the most simple form, Nintendo created Donkey Kong, Super Mario Bros, The Legend of Zelda, Metroid, the list goes on and on. They have every right, in my mind, to decide where those franchises can and can't go. With that basic concept though, the opportunity for leverage arises. With that leverage, things get much more nuanced and much more complicated. In the early days of console gaming, the bulk of games' console exclusivity was pretty straightforward. Super Mario World was exclusive to Super Nintendo because Nintendo made it. Sonic the Hedgehog was exclusive to Sega Genesis because, you guessed it, Sega made that. As the industry grew and changed, so did exclusivity. For a more complicated example of how a game became exclusive, let's talk about Pokemon. In the early to mid 90s, Nintendo partnered with independent company Game Freak to produce Pokemon Red and Green, which, as we know, was the beginning of the Pokemon franchise. As a part of this deal, Nintendo became part owner of the Pokemon brand and the company that distributes it around the world. Because of this partner ownership though, Nintendo isn't entirely in control of what the Pokemon brand does. There are Pokemon products and services available outside of Nintendo's ecosystem, but there's limits to that. Sure, Pokemon trading card game online is available to play on PC and mobile. Mainline games like Pokemon Sword and Shield are unavailable on either of those platforms, and even the games that are available on non-Nintendo platforms aren't available to play on other consoles. Despite all of this sort of relationship, in my mind, is okay. While Nintendo didn't independently create Pokemon, they are the publisher of the games that are exclusively released on their platforms. And it's also fair to say that if Nintendo never greenlit the pitch for Pokemon and helped them mold it into the juggernaut that it is, Pokemon wouldn't be what it is. It's important to note that this wasn't a case of Nintendo finding a developer and buying them because they knew they'd make them a ton of money. This was Nintendo accepting a pitch, helping them mold that into a massive success, and reaping the reward, which to me is an important thing to keep in mind in the context of this video. The relationship with Pokemon is certainly less clear than the relationship with Mario, but I think it's just as wholesome. Even before this though, there were relationships forged between companies that changed the simple concept of exclusivity from made by company for company's platform. Because of Nintendo, it happened even earlier than the likes of Sonic the Hedgehog or Super Mario World, with Nintendo's licensing policy restrictions in the NES and through much of the SNES eras. Mega Man games, for instance, were made by Capcom primarily for Nintendo platforms with some exceptions. The same could be said for games like Konami's Castlevania, Squaresoft's Final Fantasy, and Hudson Soft's Bomberman, to name a few. This is the first exclusivity acquisition practice that at the time seemed completely normal from the outside looking in, which in a lot of ways I think is responsible for how defensive some people get over alternative methods of obtaining exclusive rights to a game or property. In hindsight, I personally think this practice is underhanded and predatory. While again, I see nothing wrong with securing exclusives through the means of production, locking developers and publishers down to your platform with nothing to offer but the chance to publish on that platform is a not so subtle way to strong arm them into contributing to what, in my mind, was and is usually a further attempt at the monopolization of the game industry. In other words, this practice was so effective because NES was pretty much the only game in town. They had this status largely because all of the noteworthy games were exclusive to their platform. This, to be fair, was mostly made up of their first-party output, as is usually the case, but this standing in the market was, in my opinion, arbitrarily fortified by those licensing agreements with third parties. Eventually, largely thanks to their own first-party output and American marketing, SEGA was able to gain some ground over Nintendo in the market share department, and with that, third-party publishers were given more leverage to push back against Nintendo and their policies. Either Nintendo would allow them to also release their games on SEGA's platforms, or they'd leave them altogether, hence creating the concept of true multi-platform titles. Even back then, the concept of multi-platform releases operated essentially the same way that they do today, with some games being released on multiple platforms mostly unchanged, technology willing, looking at you Game Boy ports, like say Disney and Capcom's Lion King game. Some games being released with platform exclusive features, for lack of a better term, like Mortal Kombat and its gore, and others that are just straight up different games with the same name, like Home Alone, which was developed for the NES by Bethesda, Imagineering Inc. for Game Boy as well as SNES, and developed by Sega of America for the Genesis and Game Gear. With the introduction of new gaming platforms from tech giants like Sony and Microsoft, the practice of securing new exclusive titles and franchises continue to evolve. With this entrance into the games industry, there has been an increase in development studio poaching, for lack of a better term, in my mind dating back to the likes of Rare Studios going to Xbox, and more specifically, for the inception of this video in particular, marketing deals that result in content exclusivity within otherwise multi-platform game releases. To be fair, Microsoft largely popularized this concept as well when they secured marketing deals with third-party publishers in regards to their major gaming brands like EA's Madden and Activision's Call of Duty, but in the current generation, or I guess current and upcoming generations, this has been taken to a whole other level in my opinion. Yesterday, PlayStation announced that Spider-Man, arguably the face of all of Marvel in the minds of most, will be exclusively playable on PlayStation's platforms on the multi-platform release Marvel's Avengers. And there are a lot of clashing perspectives on this. One camp seems to be okay with it because, as I've detailed up until this point in this video, exclusive content is nothing new. And then there's the camp that I'm in. While the argument that exclusive content has by and large always been standard practice is a valid argument, this sort of exclusivity deal is much more in the NES era of shady business dealings than it is on the up and up, like the Mario creation argument. Many seem to argue that because Sony has the Spider-Man film rights, this also means they have exclusive gaming rights to the franchise, but this just isn't true. And if you give it any sort of thought, you would see that it never even appeared to be true. On one end, there has been one PlayStation exclusive Spider-Man game developed since Sony acquired the film rights to the franchise, and one new Spider-Man game on the horizon, both of which were developed by Sony-owned Insomniac Games, and as a result were heavily funded by Sony. This sort of exclusivity is the exclusivity that in my mind is justifiable. This game literally could not have happened in this capacity if Sony didn't fund it. They didn't make the Spider-Man franchise, but they did make this version of the franchise, and for that, them having exclusive rights to these games makes complete sense to me. Where things fall apart is because of this relationship this game shares with the MCU and its marketing machine, people are led to believe that they're intrinsically linked in every way imaginable. In a way, this thought is right, but not in the way that Mario is intrinsically linked to Nintendo and their marketing machine. This is a bought connection, not a created one. To bring it back to Nintendo though, something that completely debunks the concept of Spider-Man also having exclusive gaming rights with Sony is the existence of Marvel's Ultimate Alliance 3. This is a game that heavily features the Spider-Man universe and the characters within it, and yet and still is exclusive to Nintendo's platform. If Sony truly did have a similar deal with Spider-Man for games on their platform, there'd be no way Marvel's Ultimate Alliance wasn't also released on their platforms at the very least, and even if for some reason they did allow for an exclusive game featuring Spider-Man to appear on Nintendo's platform, this relationship would have to be represented in the copyright information for the game. Refer to Banjo-Kazooie in Smash Bros. Or any other third-party character being included in Smash Bros. And I bring this up not only to make it clear that it's pretty much impossible for there to be any sort of MCU-like deal going on for Spider-Man in the gaming world, but also to say, despite Marvel's Ultimate Alliance being an exclusive Marvel game that heavily features Spider-Man, that many were upset because of its console exclusivity, this is yet another example of a game that I I think justified its exclusivity pretty well. This game was made largely by Nintendo in support of Team Ninja, in addition to the publishing being entirely handled by Nintendo. This isn't something they bought mindshare for. They created a game and made it exclusive for their platform. On the other hand, Sony has nothing to do with the production of Marvel's Avengers any more than Microsoft does. This is simply Sony throwing money around to keep the mind share for Spider-Man married to that of the PlayStation brand, a separate agreement that in no way locks him down in perpetuity in the way the film rights have done, but rather in a way that's a lot closer to those akin to the Call of Duty partnerships that Xbox brought to the table in the early days of HD gaming. These were looked at pretty poorly by gamers even at the time. I'm sure largely because of Microsoft. I'm personally still down on these sort of deals being made for exclusivity in video games, but I do want to know what you think about all of this. I'm interested to discuss whatever thoughts you're willing to share in the comments down below. Also, I want to share them on our podcast this weekend, which is linked in the description. Leave us your thoughts and there's a chance that we'll discuss it in the podcast. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed the video, I'd appreciate it if you gave it a like and subscribe to this channel for more videos like it every Tuesday and Thursday at 4 p.m. Eastern Time. Okay, that's it for me. See you next week.